All right, so this is the final review for the Islamic Art and Architecture exam. It is due Tuesday, May 19th at 11:59 p.m. Okay, so first question, kind of asking the distinctive characteristics of Sufi dervish, dabke, and African Islamic dance. All right, so the dervish, right, that was based around this notion of spinning around, right? Spinning, spinning, spinning. The dervish, they're pointed up in heaven, right? So they're pointed up and they're spinning around to kind of create this sort of, how would you say, a euphoric sense or kind of, yeah, almost like a drug-induced kind of like we were talking about, or this euphoria. And so that's different than the dabke, right? So the dabke movement originates in the legs. It's through the pounding of the legs, right? Spring movements in the legs, up, down, right? Pounding. Kind of joyful, happy, pounding movements. A lot of energy, high energy, right? And there too, along with the high energy movement originating in the legs, kind of joined together, right, in groups. It's based around kind of a collective group, performed at weddings, things like that. Whereas the dervish is more of a ritual that's practiced by Sufis. And again, the Sufi dervish dates back to really the 13th century. Whereas the dabke, right, also dates back way to antiquity, but the dabke is really taken on importance in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which we'll talk about in a sec here. But the African Islamic dance, right, the point is you're hunched down, you're pointed to the earth. Movement doesn't originate in the legs, but in your shoulder movements. And the point with African Islamic dance is these spontaneous, random movements, right? So much spontaneity. There is this notion of repetition, but within the repetition, there's spontaneity. So the point with the dervish, this distinctive style of dance, is to bring down God, right? The notion was in the 13th century, God was becoming transcendent, God was becoming removed from earth. So the point for the Sufi dervish is to bring God down back to earth, right? So you're bringing him down through those circling movements, bringing God down, communing with God through your body. The dabke, right, the point there is that Palestinian communities are performing it to resist the Israeli occupation, because essentially the dabke allows Palestinians to form collective communities, a sense of collective Palestinian identity, and be joyful, happy, right, in the face of Israelis trying to eliminate Palestinians, right? So that's the real idea. So for them, God, facilitating a notion of God, is around creating this sense of collective identity, right, in the face of the Israeli occupation trying to wipe them out. African Islamic dance, right, in contrast, the notion there is about communing with God, right, again, through your body in all cases, but here the notion is about finding God through spontaneity, through randomness, right? The idea for African Muslims is that God is spontaneous, right? God appears in those random spontaneous moments, such as a pandemic, and getting yourself to basically accept that. So the notion of kind of creating order through disorder, right? Accepting that disorder, and accepting that disorder as an opportunity to commune with God. Okay, so Muslim cool, yeah. So how's it connected to Islamic art, right? Well, first of all, right, so talk about Muslim cool. Muslim cool is this distinctive way of being in the world, right? Based around being flexible, being dynamic, right? This notion of being flexible, dynamic, and ultimately cool, right? And you facilitate this through art, right? Specifically, two things that you could talk about is the hijab, right? So Islamic fashion. The hijab is this notion, this connection, right? Connecting Islam to Black American experience, right? The notion of hoods, right? Hoodies, right? Again, connected to Trayvon Martin, but this notion of Black identity connected, and hip hop specifically, connected to the hijab, right? This notion of being urban, being cool. And then you could talk about, too, the dandies, right? Muslim dandies. We talked about this with men who dress really fashionable, right, with high colors to attract white women's gaze, which is probably the most subversive thing a Black man can do, right? And we talked about that, how historically, right, the notion of white women being sexually attracted to Black men. It's very, very ancient, right? These could be examples. Also, you could talk about hip hop music. Specifically, you could talk about Brother Ali, DJ Khaled, right? Erykah Badu. These are all examples of people who use music as a mechanism to facilitate this distinctive way of being cool, right? Being flexible, being spontaneous, right? Being laid back. And ultimately, right, we talked about this allows Muslim communities to redress and really heal from the Islamophobia that they experience in the aftermath of 9/11, right? The notion that Muslims are not Americans, right? Well, no, actually, right? So there, here there are Americans that are like, you're not American, right? Well, what is the most American thing you can do? We talked about being cool, right? That is being American, right? So it's a way for them to be like, fuck you, I'm more cool than even you are. I'm more American than you. Moreover, it allows Muslim communities to form connections with Black communities. Because what happens is in the aftermath of 9/11, right, Muslim communities become racialized, right? It becomes being a Muslim suddenly becomes being a race. And Muslim communities kind of connect Islamic identity to Black American identity, right? To form kind of a coalition, an alliance against white hegemony. Okay? All right. So number 3, so calligraphy. So here you can talk about that. Calligraphy has been this ancient form of artistic practice in Islam that really dates back to the creation of the Quran, because Arabic, we talked about, it has an aesthetic base to it. Arabic was meant to be sung, right? So calligraphy, you can see this. Calligraphy almost looks like notes, music notes. So it's like Arabic drawn out music notes. So there's this lyrical bent in Islam, in the call to prayer and even in the Quran. It's very lyrical. So calligraphy was this form of writing that brought out that lyricalness to kind of Arabic and to the Quran. And then graffiti, right, is kind of merging with this ancient form of artistic practice in Islam. Graffiti dates to really urban communities, right? And it comes about as a way, kind of we talked about, a mechanism for urban communities, poor urban communities, to talk to each other, to communicate with each other. Free from the surveillance of wealthy people, right? So that's the point of graffiti. Why you can't often understand it is because it's not for you, right? You can't read graffiti, you can't understand it because it's not for you, it's not for your eyes. So graffiti is a mechanism of communication that really developed for urban communities to talk to each other, to communicate. So calligraphy is a mixing of these two styles that was really made possible by globalism, right? So calligraphy has been part of this, it's now a global language for urban Muslim communities around the globe, right? It provides a way for Muslim communities to communicate with one another and really to communicate with one another free from the surveillance of digital technologies, right? So calligraphy kind of draws on the notion of digital technology, specifically programming, right? Calligraphy kind of looks like a programming language a little bit. So it draws on this notion of kind of programming as a form of communication, global communication, while at the same time resisting the surveillance of digital technologies. Because again, calligraphy, it's for Muslim communities. Only Muslim communities, like for example, when you look at El Sayed's graffiti, can read the graffiti, right? It's for Muslims. But that's not always the case, right? So this goes into the second part of the question, who's an example of a calligraphy artist? You could talk about El Sayed, or you could talk about Syria's Banksy. We talked about Syria's Banksy. We also talked about Layla, right? The Palestinian artist, Layla Al-Zawi. She's, so you could do either Syria's Banksy, I think it's Abu Malik. So in the case of Syria's Banksy, really, he, starts as this soldier, right, we talked about, but then he goes from being a soldier to being an artist, and he really creates calligraphy for American audiences, and it's kind of like a mechanism for American artists to understand the perspective of Syrians. He also does it for Syrians too, as well, and provides calligraphy as a mechanism for Syrian communities to form a sense of home, a sense of identity. Layla Azawi, in terms of Palestine, She is a Palestinian woman, right, who's part of this living in a refugee camp in Jordan. And she uses calligraphy as a mechanism to express, Muslim women's unique understanding of Islam, to resist patriarchy, and also to provide a way to really communicate Palestinian communities' experience in these refugee camps, right? Create an awareness, kind of an understanding of what Palestinians are going through in these refugee camps. So the final question, yes, so this is a fun question. It's just an opportunity for you to really talk about things that you've learned. Don't feel too much pressure with this question. I just kind of want to get your perspective of what things like you came across when you were trying to make your museum exhibition, right? Maybe problems that you came across, potential challenges. In the final lecture that I recorded online, I talked about how Muslim museum curators have often fallen into the mistakes of using Islamic art and architecture as an opportunity for audiences to escape modernity, right? There's a notion that Islamic art and architecture is somehow escaping modernity, right? Another problem that museum curators often fall out into is this pearls of string perspective, with this notion of kind of yanking Islamic art and architecture out of its context and making it about stories about specific people, right? Specifically Islamic caliphates, right? It tends to be male dominated. And it doesn't really tell you the whole scope of the art and architecture. It doesn't really give you that historical, political context, right? So you could talk about some of these problems, or you could, and any problems you came across as you were working, and any suggestions you have. If you were a museum curator, how would you tell the story, right? What would you want to tell about Islamic art and architecture? How would you approach an Islamic art and architecture exhibit? So again, don't feel like there's a right answer to question 4. Just trying to understand your perspective. So the exam, again, is due on Tuesday, May 19th at 11:59 p.m., okay? So thank you again, guys. You were a great class. I miss y'all, okay? Good luck and have a great summer.